Hello and welcome to Happy Hours with me. I am Eileen Cook. Today is April 16th. This is a special Tuesday night edition that I'm having because I have a bunch of workers coming tomorrow and there will be nothing but barking. So I thought I would go ahead and talk this evening about info dumping. So the dreaded info dump. So first, I think it might be useful to talk about what an info dump actually is. And then we'll talk about why you don't want to do it. And then we'll have hopefully a couple suggestions on how you can get rid of them. So basically, an info dump is exactly what it sounds like. An info dump is any time when you have a huge amount of sort of exposition or explanation that is happening in the course of a scene that actually doesn't have anything to do with the scene itself. It's usually something that's happening in the background. So things that are common info dumps are things such as, how does magic work? So let me explain that. How my particular abilities work. Character backstory is a huge thing that often comes in info dump. Sort of world rules or history that's happening. Technology, particularly in sci-fi books, tends to get dumped into info. And certainly in sort of fantasy novels, there's sometimes a pause where we get into sort of descriptions of characters. So why don't we like info dumps? The biggest reason is it tends to throw the reader out of the story because it feels like, even though you're hopefully not saying this, it feels like a, as you know, kind of thing. And so as someone who just spent time with family, I don't know if you've ever had the experience where whatever your parents are talking about, they suddenly feel the need to go back and fill you all in. So I will give a prime example. So it'll be something like, my dad will say something like, yeah, we're going to get the tree in the front yard cut down. And I'll be like, oh. And then my dad will be like, well, as you know, in the neighborhood, there's all these kinds of rules about when you can cut down trees and when you can't cut down trees. And it all stems back to so-and-so who lived in the neighborhood in such and such, and he cut down a bunch of trees. And then, hey, Jane, what was that guy's name? I can't remember. His wife, what was his wife's name? Was it Susan? No, it wasn't Susan. Susan was the name of so-and-so's wife. Oh, right. Right. They were the people who did that. Yeah. So what was his wife's name? And then the story about getting the tree cut down has now become a treatise, and to everyone who's ever lived in my parents' neighborhood, the longevity of how long they've lived in the neighborhood, whether or not they were good neighbors, and what kinds of things they like to plant. So speaking for myself as someone who just spent time with my parents, this is really not that interesting to me. All I'm really wanting to know is what's happening with the tree that is getting cut down. Now, if my parents were telling a story or if it was a novel, they may want to have some of the history of the neighbors and what happened between the neighbors because they think it's really important. So what do you do with info dump? I'm curious, does anyone here want to say how they handle it? Bonnie, how have you tackled it as someone who had to deal, she loves when I call on her, well, who has to deal with things like magic happening in your scenes?
Well, I try to work it in as if everybody already knows about it. And then when my critiquers go, I don't know what the frick you're talking about, I'll add a little bit more. And I usually overdo it. And then they say, oh, it's too much like an info dump. And then I take it back. And somewhere in the middle is where it works. But I try not to introduce anything unless the character is actually interacting with it or using it. There's no need to talk about the past neighbors unless your father is speaking to that neighbor or they just, drove their truck into the window. Then there's no need to know about all the other neighbors.
Anyone else? How do you tackle info dumps?
Go, Natasha.
You have to unmute. There you go.
Yeah, I highlight it. Because I'm writing historical. It's a lot like fantasy in that you kind of have to, like Bonnie says, I assume that people know, and then, but it's a bit hard. So I basically just highlight anything that looks like info, and then I try and take it out and see how much works, see if it still works without it. And if it does, then I hope it works. That's my sage advice.
So the two questions that I'd sort of suggest people ask themselves, first off, is does it matter? And the second question, which is sort of related, is how much of it matters? So I think that is kind of the balance that you two are talking about, which is that idea of putting some in and then taking it out. And I think one of the interesting things is you talked about, what do the characters know? So I want you to imagine that we're 100 years in the future, but someone is writing a book about this time. So they have two characters talking who, of course, would know who, for example, President Trump is, and that it's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We would know that now. That would be a very odd thing for me to be like, well, Bonnie, as you know, the President of the United States is Donald Trump, and he's a bit of a boob sometimes, right? Like that would be like a very odd thing for me to say. So how would you potentially slide that in? Because keep in mind, 100 years from now, people may not necessarily know who the president is at that time or who the prime minister is. Natasha.
Well, you could just have characters ranting about what a boob the president is.
Or how much they like him, right?
Oh,
so one
how
is,
much they like him, as some do.
So sometimes it would be that idea of having a conversation, and that's really the idea of filtering it through the character. So what does the character think of Justin Trudeau? What does the character think of Donald Trump? And so they're speaking directly about that character. What are other ways you could kind of slide it in? Dead silence. All right. So
newspaper headlines, radio. Yeah, I mean, it depends upon how important it is.
Yeah. So sometimes, you're trying to set the scene. So you're trying to set an idea. Again, if we're writing a historical novel, you may want to have like, these are some fairly major characters that may be involved in setting that time period. Or for example, if you said to me right now, who was the prime minister or the president of the United States 100 years ago? I actually don't know. Like I'd have to
look it up.
I'd have to look that up, and I'd have to Google.
I'm not unmuted, I guess.
So I'd have to look it up. So if I did that, and I'm actually curious, so I'm just going to do a quick thing and open that up. All right, so the President of the United States in 1917 was just the first one I looked up, was Woodrow Wilson. So there you have it. So I might sort of, drop in something where people are talking about him, just so that people have sort of a context. As Natasha mentioned, people can talk about, there could be, a break into in 1917, it would be the radio. So there might be something like a character might say, the radio was droning on about Wilson's recent blah, blah, blah. So maybe some piece of legislation that might come through. And again, if we were writing a book about our time, someone might talk about the burning of the Cathedral Notre Dame, which was just heart-wrenching. I watched that yesterday. All right. So someone might, if they want to mention a way to sort of mention the time and the thing, might be talking about Trump tweeting about how they should handle it, right? Which turned out to be not actually a good way to handle it. Don't dump water on it. So, those would be, something that could kind of interject that way. So it could be something that's happening in the background. It could be another way that you might sort of do it is a character's reacting to something that's happened in the news, or it has some direct impact on them. So I am a character who is dealing with something that's happened in the news. So I'm involved in the Trudeau is coming to town and I'm preparing for it. So I'm talking about the fact that he's coming to town and it's shut down the streets and that I'm organizing this thing, or it's preventing me from getting to work. Maybe I have nothing to do with him, but what's going on? Oh, Trudeau's in town. Well, great. Now I'm late to work. And this is how that deals with the scene. So I've just sort of dripped in this detail that might help ground a reader if I'm trying to set sort of a historical context without getting into a big info dump. Well, as you know, Trudeau is our prime minister currently. Yes. So Bonnie jumped in. You could have a comparison. So we have, Prime Minister Natasha Powell, who is ruling 50 years from now. And so we're comparing, her to Justin Trudeau and how that's different. So I think the biggest thing is trying to figure out if you can make whatever the info dump is relevant to the existing scene that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So some way to make it connected to what's actually happening and the scene that is hopefully moving your actual plot forward. So if a character has to use magic in that scene, then that becomes a time to sort of drip in some details, right? Like she wanted to do a transfiguring spell, but she knew she wasn't allowed to because she was under 16. Only magicians at the Bonnie level were able to take on spells of that magnitude. So it's just a small thing, but for the reader, they're getting a little bit like, okay, there's some rules about when you can use these spells and when you can't use these spells. And now I know that you have to be a level Bonnie to do that.
Yeah. And President Powell said that we couldn't do it until we've turned 20 at least.
Yes. That sounds like something President Powell would say. Right? So something that is directly related to what's happening now. Natasha, you look like you're about to say something.
Well, I was just thinking about, in terms of curiosity too. Like, it's an interesting comparison because with in the world of magic, to sort of just a little hint would make the reader more curious. But in terms of history, that's an interesting point. So would it work the same way in that you would want to make the reader a little curious about what the world is? Because it doesn't matter, even if it's historical, every person experiences it differently. So I have sort of a question. I just haven't articulated it, but maybe Eileen is smart enough to figure out what I'm asking.
Eileen thinks she's smart enough to take a peek at it.
Well, she is. It's just like, have I articulated it enough?
So, I mean, one of the ways is, I think one of the things that I love best about historical novels is the opportunity to see something that I might have read about played out, and the opportunity for me to learn something. So I'll give two very different examples. So I might be reading a book about medieval England, and the character will be getting dressed, and there'll be a thing like she's frustrated because it took over 30 minutes to get dressed. She had to be laced into this on top of this with a corset of this, and the sleeves were removed. Like, and then I'm just sort of interested, right? Because it's like, oh, that stuff I did not know, but I'm intrigued to sort of hear about it. So as long as it doesn't go on too long, and again, the thrust of the scene is, as a character, I want to get downstairs to a fancy dinner party that's happening, and I'm frustrated because it takes so long for me to get into my get up. That's sort of intriguing to me to sort of hear those historical details. The other way is, again, that there's something about how it impacts that character. So let's say we're writing a World War II novel, and we're still in England, and we are dealing with the Blitz that's going on. And so what would be interesting to me is someone who's sort of read about the bombing happening in London and what that was like, is how that might be experienced by very different people in the city. So someone who might be in a wealthy home and what's happening for them versus someone who might be a maid or across town and what her experience is. And so sort of hearing what it's like for them would be sort of intriguing for me to do that. Somewhat of what you're trying to do in historical is sort of get a sense of flair. That's why I think a lot of historical novels tend to talk about food a fair bit, because people are sort of interested in this idea of, what are people eating and what does that look like, and how does that happen? Having said that, I think a little can go a long way. Like, I think that's one of the things that we forget. And that's why I think the two questions back to back are really important, which is, does it matter and how much of it matters? And again, I think, Natasha, to kind of get to your point, a little does go a long way. So sort of talking about, if I don't know a ton about the Blitz, what is it that I need for the reader to understand, which is, okay, the city is getting bombed, and that this is like people are dying from this. Like, it's not just a little like hunker down and carry on. Like, it was, a big thing. And then for the plot, I may need it for people to understand that people are going down into the subways. Because what I want is that my character, who's normally a very posh person, is caught when there's a raid, and so she has to go down to the subway. So she's going to meet a dashing fellow who she would otherwise never normally interact with. So things that I actually don't know. I don't have any idea how long they would be down in those subways. Like, obviously I haven't done any research into this, but, perhaps I want to see where, so, I might talk about like, most bombing raids, they were only down there for a bit. Oh, Natasha knows the answer to this.
Well, I don't. Of course, it depends upon how long the raid is. But I've watched things, so I've done no research, but I've watched things because I find this time period interesting, even though I don't write about it. I think they could be there overnight.
Yeah,
they could be going home for dinner, and they'd have to wait until morning before it was safe to leave. So
the plot thickens. My plans until this moment, never before thought about scene where there's going to be true love meeting on, like, where these two very, very different people meet. So it's the posh girl, and it's this, dashing fellow who's in the service trade of some sort, and he protects her at some point or carves out a spot for her on the subway platform. And they're now going to be there overnight. So I have this thing where true love could bloom where it normally would not. And so, I need to know my details, but I don't necessarily need to have all of them. Now, what I may want to do is have some kind of info dump where it is a pregnancy ensues. I'm like, why is everyone laughing? So yeah, it's a crowded subway platform, Bonnie. That's not happening. All right. So what I do want to have, however, is maybe I want to talk about the fact that she loves someone who died earlier in the war. So she is brokenhearted by this sort of lost love. Or maybe she's not. Maybe it was someone her parents wanted her to marry, and she feels guilty that she's kind of glad he's dead because now she doesn't have to marry him. That's better. We're going to go with that. So I want to mention that. So what I may do is the infamous flashback scene, right? So as Yvonne touched the hand of Simon, she couldn't help but think about Charles, and then it switches to italics. She'd known Charles since they were children, blah, 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 and a little bit of info dump about Charles and sort of things, and then back to the present time. You can do that. And certainly there are tons of books that have flashback scenes happening. But I think the key to understand is that it is a flashback. So the best way I tend to think of it as you are driving the story forward. We're in this car, we're telling a story. Whenever you do a flashback, you're like, wait a minute, you've got to notice this. And you pop that sucker in reverse, and you just sort of take the car back and go back to sort of talking about what's happening before you pop it back into drive. And Bonnie has gone completely into the story. She's going to be writing it. So with Charles, it had been so easy drifting from friendship to love. But this was a spark, a flame that was burning like the city outside. Right? So we're going to have to copyright this by the end of tonight. I think that's the rule. Only the four of us here can share in the royalties.
I'm sticking to cliches, so it should be fine.
We're good.
But it's a way of introducing a comparison as I guess. Yeah,
comparison works really well. Yeah. Whenever you're doing a flashback, I think all that you want to do is, one, make sure that it's clear to the reader that we are going back. So that's why you'll often see some kind of transitional line, something like with Charles, it had been so easy, or she couldn't help but think of her relationship with Charles, or she couldn't help but think of when she'd first met her previous fiance, like something like that, where the reader's like, oh, we're going back in time. And that's often why you'll often see flashbacks also happening in italics, because it's actually a visual cue to the reader, like, oh, this is not part of our main storyline. And then you'll see some kind of transitional line that takes us back to the present. The walls shook with the bombing raid, instantly taking her back to the present. Simon covered her with his coat to keep the falling pebbles from her hair, right? So there's something that sort of then, okay, now we're back in the present time. So if you are wanting to do an info dump, so you want to get in all this information about her previous relationship with Charles, a flashback scene is one way to do it, but then keep in mind that you want that to be interesting as well. It's not just like a dry recitation of the facts. Natasha.
I have a little question. I do have I don't know, I missed the very first bit of this, but I have a question about a story that I'm working on, and I don't know, and it relates to info dump and flashback, because I have my heroine is going to be drowning, and she wishes she had learned to swim. But it wasn't ladylike at the time for girls to go in the water, and her two brothers, who are now dead and are sort of important, their death is important to the story, but only to her life, so in the background, so I don't really need to mention them. So interestingly, how would I, like, obviously I want to mention them and the fact that they died long before she's in the situation where she's drowning, but how much of it and how soon, because I don't want the reader to completely forget. So yeah, anyway.
That she's drowning?
No, that she doesn't know how to swim, and because it wasn't ladylike, and that her brothers had begged her to jump in the water with them and learn to swim. It's a minor thing. It's just an explanation.
So I'll welcome other people to chime in, but of course I always have a thoughts
and
on
opinion.
this.
Yes,
I do. Right. So one is, what is it that needs to happen in this scene? So whether or not the fact that her brothers are dead is something that has come up before.
Yes.
Right. So I would make sure, like, I wouldn't want to be trying to get into the scene while she's drowning,
no,
that her brothers are gone and she wishes that she had learned to swim, and like a whole bunch of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, what's her name? Violet. Right. So,
Victorian.
Violet sputtered, her dress filling with water, pulled her back under the water. Right. She could almost picture her brother Charles as a kid. Come on, Violet, get into the water, right? She burst to the surface, taking another air. She should have learned to swim. Like, so I might sort of break it in between those two different things. Mm-hmm. I might have her picturing, like, if she's going down for the last time, it might be the fact, like, her brothers, maybe they yelled out advice. Like, I'm thinking, my cousins taught me how to swim. People I saw actually when I was back visiting family. And the way that my cousins taught me to swim was the time-honored tradition. My grandmother lived me in lake, near Lake Michigan, and they would drag us out, myself and my other younger cousin, into the water. They would hurl us into the water, and then we would basically sputter and drag ourselves to shore, vomiting up water and whatnot. And then they would offer suggestions like, next time use your arms more. And then they would drag us back out and do it all over again.
No trauma involved in swimming.
No, not at all, right? But, that kind of thing. So it might have been the thing where, like, since she wouldn't get into the water, they would, be showing her in the water. Look at me, Violet, right? See, it's easy, right? And so she might be trying desperately to remember what they had showed her.
Okay, thank you. That's
right.
Interesting. That's kind of the way I've set it up, but I'm just curious to know how an expert would do it.
Yeah. Because I also think, like, thinking about, again, how the characters would do it. So saying something like, swimming was not something that ladylike women did. So Violet had never learned how to swim. her brothers had wanted her to learn, but she wouldn't ever go in the water, is dry. But if it's something like Violet remembered how she would lay in bed at night and practice the arm movements she saw her brothers doing. She wished she could learn to swim, but she knew her mother would never approve, because that tells me something about her as a character, right? Like that she desperately wanted to be someone who could learn how to swim, but was afraid to flaunt the convention. Or maybe she, remembered being sniffy, like, I would never do something so, you know what I mean? So base, so common, right? So now she's regretting the fact that she never wanted to learn to swim. So that might be a way that I would be kind of going back and forth with thinking about who is she? And like, did she admire her brothers? Did she think they were ridiculous? Like, that's a chance. You'll hear me sometimes talk about trying to get as much bang for the buck out of something, right? So if I can mention, like, the important thing is that she doesn't know how to swim, and that's what I want people to understand. But I also then, this is maybe a chance for me to talk about how she was a bit of a rebel. So maybe when she was in the bathtub, she tried to, do something, or she tried to swim on her bed to see if she could do it that way. Or, was it that she thought that that was common and she was glad, like she remembers seeing little kids jumping off the bridge while walking home from church and thinking like, oh, they're so common, they're in the river, like she would never do something like that. It's a chance to tell me a little bit about her. And what does she think of the fact that she doesn't know how to swim? And so that gives me a little bit of bang for the buck. That's above and beyond just the fact, right? So that's how I would do it. Dialogue is a great way, right? So for characters, if they're meeting someone that, now obviously when you're drowning, you're not really having a scene like, oh, Bonnie, glub, 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 glub. I've been meaning to mention to you, blah, 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 right? So that's probably not going to happen. But it's possible that Violet is having a conversation as they're walking along the water, right? That might happen earlier in the scene. Which again, sometimes can set up foreshadowing or something like that, where you might want to have something where she's watching other people jump off into the water and thinking about her brothers. Or maybe there's if you haven't mentioned before that her brothers are dead, maybe there's a casket being carried off a nearby ship. And so it forces her to remember when they had to, she and her parents had to greet her brother's casket as it was brought back into town from wherever. So that's a chance to sort of tell me that, if that detail hasn't come up. I think the problem is sometimes what we're trying to do is cram way too much into one scene. So we feel like everyone has to know all the rules of magic. So I have to tell them exactly how magic works and how it started and all the different things about it. And maybe it's enough to just know that there is magic and that there are some kind of rules around who's allowed to use it, and that my character does not fall into those rules. And later there might be, more discussion between two characters about that. Like, I can't believe you did that transfiguring spell. Prime Minister Pow doesn't allow people to do that. And then we have, some sort of discussion around, right? Like, well, in my mom's day, anyone could do magic. Well, yeah, but that was before the revolution, right? So there's something similar happening that way. I just read an amazing ARC for a book that comes out in the summer, which is called, it's a great YA if people are interested, called Verify. And it's very 1984. So it takes place in sort of a dystopian future where there's, very little or no crime. And there's this girl in Chicago and she's going around and they're just sort of dribbling in little details. So in the very opening scene, she sees someone being arrested and they drop a piece of paper. And she sort of talks about the idea that she hadn't seen paper in years. Everyone has turned in paper. Like, why this person wouldn't have taken it back to one of the mandatory recycling stations, blah, blah, blah. And then nothing else is said about it, right? But then in a later scene, you find out that all books have been turned to electronic books. And then, of course, much later, she's going to meet a character who's going to be talking about the fact that certain words, such as verify, have disappeared. And that because there is no paper, that they can change the history books because everything is electronic. So what people know is of their history is skewed completely through the government. But there isn't this long info dump where you get this huge history of, the fact that there was this sort of revolution and the government took over and all these people were, carted away who didn't go along with the government story. And then anything that was printed that didn't adhere to the truth was taken away, and words were just taken out of dictionaries. And so people don't even necessarily understand the concept of, oh, you should question something. Like verify isn't needed because of course the government tells you the truth. Like there's no other sense that you would question those things. So it's a very interesting thing. And I think it's what got me thinking about info dump is because I was chatting with the person who wrote it. Joelle Charbonneau, she wrote the testing series, if people read that one, which was lovely. And she's done, you got those on your shelf. Yeah, she's an amazing writer, and I really quite like her. And so we had an interesting talk about, she had a very clear sense, and she's obviously very motivated by current politics and things that are happening about this idea of fake news and what is truth and all of those kinds of things are certainly what's motivated her to write this book. But so she had a very clear idea of what the world looked like. But she does a very good job as in the beginning, there's a lot of things that are very similar. Like the character rides her bike to school. She's meeting her friends. Like she has a tablet, but that didn't seem that strange to me. Like I think more and more kids are getting their textbooks on tablets. So there, it was just this odd mention of the fact that there was no paper that for me as a reader was this thing where it was like, oh, wait, that's really different. But it's just this tiny thing that is happening, and the fact that she's running late for school, and the fact that the police have closed down this thing to arrest this person. So it's blocking her from getting to school, and it's clear that being just late to school is a bad thing. She's very anxious and concerned about it. So it's just those kind of things, but it's setting up this idea that there's a lot more to happen. So I think that is interesting. And then there's a little bit that's also happening in dialogue. So you have two characters who she's talking to her best friend, where it's like, well, why were you late? Well, they were arresting some guy who had paper. And she's like, paper? And then she's sort of talking about like, her friend is the one who's like, why anyone wouldn't turn that. It's clearly that it's been unpatriotic to not turn in your paper. Like no one is so you're getting like, first you get this idea that paper is weird, but then you're getting more through the dialogue about her friend sort of talking about, someone who would do that obviously isn't concerned at all about the environment. They want to go back to a time when there's this or there's that. So there's this kind of interesting moment that happens there. So dialogue is certainly a way of doing that. Any other questions about info dumps or sneaking them in? I'm laughing at Bonnie's story in the chat window where she's dying of drowning, but how foolish. She would never have killed Charles. But then again, Charles had been allowed to swim. No, he died of a gunshot. Damn the Huns. Right? So it just goes on and on. All right, so that is what I wanted to say about info dump. Does anyone have questions on anything else this evening? It's a quiet crowd. All right, so after this week, I should be going back to my regular office hours, which will again be on Wednesday mornings. Bonnie, you're headed out. Are you going on a writing cruise or some other type of cruise?
Just a husband cruise. Some time alone.
That sounds lovely. So enjoy that. I will send you an email back with times because I forgot to do that, so I will. For everyone else, I
did have a question.
Oh.
Yeah. What do you do if you write a query and some people love it and other people rip it to shreds? How do you figure out what you should be listening to? Maybe some of the people that liked it are just sweet, nice people, and maybe the people that ripped it to shreds are really mean people. So
I think both of those are very valid. I think honestly, to be honest, queries are the bane of every writer's existence, topped only by the synopsis, which is more evil than anything else, I think. But what I would say with the query is, one, asking people why they didn't like it.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was something in particular that they bumped on that you might be able to nudge. And conversely, you can ask people who liked it, what is it that they like? I would be the first to admit that I do not think that my query letter was brilliant. And I think to be honest, it's really hard to write one that is going to appeal to everyone. So the fact that some people like it and some people hate it is exactly what's going to happen when you send out to agents. Right? Because there's going to be the agent who's like, oh my gosh, I'm so intrigued. That's fascinating, right? And someone else who's going to not be remotely interested in it because it's not even their type of thing.
Right.
So the people who dislike it, one, I would be curious, are they fantasy readers? Because if they are not, it's possible part of what's throwing them is, well, I'm not really sure I'm interested in that character's motivation. It's like, well, maybe it's because you don't like dragons. So there's nothing that you're going to say, like they would have you rewrite the query so that it's more of a romance query, which is not the thrust of your story. So sometimes it is that idea of backing up. I always think of the most important thing that I want to establish with a query is genre. So the agent knows what it is, length, so they know what that is, and the basic character and problem and stakes. If you can have that, it's there. If you can somehow have a hint of your voice, I think it's a little bit of a home run.
That's the tricky one.
Well, and to be honest, I think for me, that the thing that I love best about your query, Bonnie, is the thing that probably has the least to do with the story, because I just feel like it shows your voice. So at the end of Bonnie's query, she has a line that says, and I'm going to screw this up, but it's something like, I 100% believe in dragons and I'm ready to help them come back at any time. It's something like that. It's better.
I have to look it up.
Yeah, it's better than that, but it's something like that. And what I liked about that line is it was a little bit whimsical. It also, to me, reminded me of the main character, Becca. So Becca believes in dragons despite the fact that no one else does, and she's willing to do anything. So to me, there is this echo of Bonnie, but also Becca. So it just gives me that slight taste of what her voice is like, and that is what sticks out the most to me. Otherwise, I think it sets up what I need to, which is, what are the stakes that Becca has to do this, otherwise this other thing, and if Gregor doesn't do this, the dragons will disappear again. Do you want to read your line, Bonnie? Did you find it?
I totally believe dragons were real and they will return. I intend to be their champion against extinction.
There. So I just
But
like that.
Just me. But yeah, that is my voice. So I don't know. I wasn't able to get it in the query. So.
Well, I think it's really hard to get it into the query. And that's where I think looking always at very specific word choice. So if you're writing a historical, if there's something that you can use that might be an older term, like that might match with that. So you might be like, Natasha moves through the world of gaslights and something on the search for who killed her mother, blah, blah, blah. So it's just a way of kind of maybe trying to set a little bit of feel and tone into that. I think can sort of help a little bit. But to be honest, the query letter, I mean, obviously your sole goal is to try and get them to read the first few pages. And I think what is nice now is that almost universally, most agents are asking for the first few pages as part of the query.
And that helps a lot. Yeah.
And I think that makes a huge difference. It used to be mailed in just the query and then hope that they would ask for a partial, and then you sent that in, and then you hope they'd ask for a full. And I'm so old, I remember doing this in the mail. So you actually had to spend a stamp to have them reject you. How awful was that? But what I can say about that process is I think almost universally, not 100%, but almost universally, people look at the query just to first say to themselves, is this a book that I'm even remotely interested in? So you might get someone who's like, nah, I'm not doing any more dragon fantasies, and they won't read. If it's remotely in their zone, I think they will read those first couple pages just to see if the story and voice engages them. And to be honest, that's very similar to readers, right? So when I walk into a chapter store, if there's an Old West book sitting on the shelf, I walk past it. Like, I don't even open it.
You're not interested. Yeah.
I'm just not interested. Now, there may be the odd time, like let's imagine you're at the new fiction shelf, right, where they have sometimes written up a little something. There might be something that if the write-up was so amazing and so clever, might make me pick up the Western and look a little bit closer. But that better be one damn hell of a good write-up, because in general, I'm just not a Western reader. And so I'm going to take a pass right over it. So I would not take a look. So, but if it had, like, if it's like, oh, it's a YA thriller, I almost invariably will open it up and at least read the first couple of pages, because I love YA thrillers.
Go figure.
You know, something I'm gonna like. I like adult thrillers. I'll definitely take a look at most of those and be much more interested. If it's something else that's on the borderline, then I'm much more likely to, again, maybe take another little bit of a look. But really all you're trying to do with the query is say, this is a YA thriller, and here's a little bit about what it's, so they hopefully will be like, okay, I want to read the pages.
Okay, so honestly, we stress way too much about the query.
I think so. And it's basically because I think, you know, sometimes there are going to be people who are going to reject it, but it wouldn't matter how fancy you wrote that query. No. It's not like you're going to put unicorn glitter in there and then get their attention. Hang on, I'm going to cough something up here.
I'll say I know President Powell.
Name dropping works, right? Yeah, I can go back again. You know, when I started this business, a lot of people were doing mail queries, and I remember my agent saying that someone mailed her a shoe, and inside the shoe it said, "Now that I have my foot in the door, I can't wait to tell you about my novel."
No.
And so she was horrified, because she was like, "It clearly was a used shoe." Like,
no.
Had it been a new shoe, then, you know, and her size, then
yeah,
perhaps.
Or you would have written for the other shoe. Yeah, because it was only one shoe. What are you going to do with one shoe? So it was this very weird, like they were trying to be really clever and gotcha-y. She got another one that was a thriller novel, and the person had written the entire query like a ransom note. So it was all cut out of magazines and glued to the paper. And she was like, interesting, but also kind of weird and creepy, right? Like to the point where like that query might have worked for some people because at least it matched the tone, but it was also just weird.
Yeah, so and also neither of those sound terribly professional, although you do hear about all these types of, you know, with interviews that people get there, they do come up with every once in a while. A successful one is you know, somebody has done something peculiar. And
for every person who gets a job because they took out a billboard and sat beneath it and somebody driving by on the highway spotted them, 6 million other people found jobs because they turned in a resume and I was going to say a query letter, but they're not query cover letters, right? So the bulk of people who are getting their jobs are getting it by going ye old fashioned way. And I think it's the same with queries, that a lot of times we're trying really hard to come up with something super clever and califragilistic. But the truth of the matter is, all you're trying to do is say, this is what I've written. This is a little bit about what it's about. And then hopefully intrigue them enough that they will take a look at those first few pages. If people aren't reading it, there's so many reasons that they're not picking it up that have nothing to do with your story. And it wouldn't matter the 6 million different ways that you try to say it. They either don't want any more fantasy, they hate dragons, their mother was killed by a dragon, you named the dragon after their ex-husband, so they can't even read the query without thinking, you asshole. Like, there are so many things that have nothing to do with your story or writing. They just signed 2 other dragon, you know, authors, and so they don't think they're going to take on, like, that you trying to guess that was just the surefire way to driving yourself crazy pants. And we're already crazy enough as writers without going that extra mile. So I think the biggest thing you want to do is, and in fact, my agent just says basically all she wants to know is who, what, why. Like, this is what's happening. This is what it's about. And if she's like, if I get that, then I'll read the pages. If it's something I'm interested in, if it's not, then I just pass on to the next thing. So, 6 million ways of doing it don't do you a lot. If you can get a little bit of sparkle in there, which again is partly why I like Bonnie's line, I think that really helps. I think some kind of stakes is useful so that you kind of know like why it matters. Like, this will be the end of humankind if this doesn't happen. This will be a return of the plague. The killer will get away. Like, the Hitler will win the war. Like, whatever it is, that just gives the reader some place to go from there. Other questions on queries or anything else for that matter?
What does Serena say?
It's in the chat window. She says, I'm trying to figure out what to take for, what's the NV?
Nevada?
Nevada.
I don't know.
Thank you. SCBWI roundtable. Is it better to take something that's polished as there be agents there, or take a second draft piece that you need more help with? I think it honestly comes down to what do you most want to get from that session. So I always, because I'm a big fan of always being prepared, I might have both with me. So if there's a particular agent that's at your particular roundtable that is one you'd really like to pitch, then I'd probably talk about the polished piece with them. And if you're then grouped, because I know sometimes you have choice about where you end up and sometimes you don't. So sometimes it's almost like a speed dating thing where then another table comes by and I might be like, I'd love to get some feedback on this idea that I have. Sometimes you're going with a very particular purpose. So I'm working on this piece and I'm really stuck and I'd love to get some more feedback from that. So that's what I want to do, versus you might be like, I'm going to this conference with the goal of pitching as many people as I want, or as I can possibly, squeeze in that time. So the first and most important thing, which I think is useful for any conference, is thinking about like, what's your biggest priority? And then if you have any luck about knowing who might be at your table ahead of time, I may shift up what I'm doing at a particular roundtable. If there's an agent there that I know is like, that's one of the people that I really was hoping to get in front of, then I would take the advantage to go ahead and do that. Does that help? There's a nod. All right. And Natasha says, you also might get more information when you're at the event, which is true. That's a chance to sometimes if you're chit-chatting with other people, they might let you know who else is there, or someone that you might want to talk to that you hadn't initially planned to, that kind of thing. In general, if I have to choose, if I have something to pitch, then I'm probably pitching that because there may be other places to get the feedback. Although sometimes we want to talk to editors and agents because we're curious to hear if they have a particular take on it. The only thing to remember when you're asking about feedback on a draft piece is that everyone's going to have a preference, which may not be your preference. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind as well. Other questions? No? Then it may be time to join Natasha with a glass of wine.
Sadly, this is not wine. I wish it were. It's club soda.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
I'm doing sparkling water with grapefruit in it.
Oh yeah, so
this stuff is
the
spectacular.
same hill.
So I could do that all the time. And since I have to teach for SFU, I probably should not drink wine until that is over.
Yes.
That's the key there.
We're still recording, so I will wait till we're not.
All right. Well, I will turn off
It's not
recording,
appropriate.
and people who are not here will wonder what they're going to miss, which is what you should come to office hours. All right.